those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. Today's review is of The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic by Gillian Peterson and James Densley. Using data from the writer's extensive research on mass shooters, including first-person accounts from the perpetrators themselves, this groundbreaking book outlines new pathways to prevention and innovative ways to stop the social contagion of violence. Peterson and Densley share their data-driven solutions for exactly what we must do at the individual level, in our communities, and as a country to put an end to these tragedies that have defined our modern era. Our reviewer today is John M. Klofus, PhD. Dr. Klofus is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Department of Criminal Justice at Rochester Institute of Technology. He has served as chairperson of the department and is the founder of the RIT Center for Public Safety Initiatives, or CPSI. CPSI is a locally focused research center and think tank addressing social issues including crime, violence, and criminal justice reform that trains students to engage in research relevant to their communities. The motto for CPSI reflects the historical commitment of social scientist Kurt Lewin: no research without action, and no action without research. Professor Klofus has also served as an expert in national violence reduction programs and has worked with major city police departments across the country on court-ordered police reform initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Professor Klofus to our podium.
So is this working now? Okay. You may regret that later. I was going over my notes from when I first spoke to Susan and others, and I couldn't read my handwriting very well, so I believe that I have 2.5 hours for this presentation. Thank you all very much for coming. I deeply appreciate it. It's an extraordinarily important topic, I think, and there's been no shortage of difficulties associated with mass shootings as a component, at least, of violence overall, which is a critically important topic as a whole. I remember early on here working with Mayor Tom Ryan, in the early 1990s when we had when a very big concern around violence arose, and we had 68 homicides that year, which is the first time that we really were at even close to that level. Last year we had 81 homicides overall, and we're on a pace now with almost 60, or right around 60 at this point in time, to certainly pass where we were just last year. Violence is a critical issue. Violence of all kinds is an absolutely critical issue. This book in particular is about mass shootings and mass violence, but it's hard to separate these out in some ways. And I think perhaps the most significant difference between them is the fact that when Tom Ryan and that committee came together and produced a report which was called A Will to Reduce Violence. And by the way, I just got a call a couple of weeks ago from Bill Johnson, who said to me that, I remember the report, A Will to Reduce Violence, had a lot of recommendations and stuff. He says, but the most important thing about that report was its title, because that has been, that has really foretold what the strengths and weaknesses of our efforts to address violence in this community have been. And I thought that was a very significant recognition overall. The big difference, I think, between the kind of violence that we have dealt with here ordinarily and the material in this book, the big difference is that the effort to deal with violence in the community here has really appropriately focused on understanding that violence and understanding the motives that underlie that violence and trying to intervene and do something. The difficulty with taking that and applying it to the mass violence, mass shooting stuff is that the importance of the relationship between victims and offenders that marks most all violence, right? And sometimes those relationships may be very brief. They may be a conflict, a fight. Sometimes they may go on for a very long time. But understanding that relationship is the first thing that you typically try to figure out to be able to see if you can intervene in those kinds of situations and reduce the levels of homicide. The unique character of mass violence, of mass shootings, is that the chief element of them is there is not a relationship between most victims and most offenders, and that affects many of the ways that we think about this problem. That's what makes it probably more frightening than most other things. The idea that you have to confront the fact that no one is safe from that kind of violence because it's unpredictable. It happens all over the place. It happens under all kinds of different sorts of circumstances. So it really presents itself very, very differently. At the same time, and that difference, I think, overpowers a lot of thinking about it, but at the same time, that issue of no relationship between victims and offenders typically on this issue also means that as frightening as this is, it is, from any statistical perspective, a very rare event. So we are very much frightened by this and very much intrigued by it. But there are now, and this book cites this number, there are now 50 or 51 over the past several years, 51 mass shooting related deaths a year that have occurred. If you look at homicide across the country, it's right now about 25,000 homicides that occur, and there's another 20 to 30,000 suicides that occur by gun. So with regard to gun violence, that issue of violence involving guns and homicides in particular is really an astronomical number when you compare it with mass shootings and when you compare it with violence across the country. This is a uniquely American situation, both in terms of the level of violence overall and the level of homicides overall, and particularly with for this discussion, the level of mass shootings that have gone on. This is a uniquely American issue, and that's a point made quite well, I think, in this book. But the violence problem, the mass shooting issue, is a component of it. But numerically, statistically, it pales compared to the risk of homicide and violence on city streets around the country. This book does a very good job, I think, laying out a number of the factual situations regarding violence. I will say this, that they studied for this, the two of the authors, one started as a teacher and one started as an attorney working in the jails in New York City. But the authors on this now have put together this book by collecting data on 171 or 2 cases of these kinds of shootings. They then were determined, when they started to do this, they were determined to interview living shooters from mass shooting cases. And they attempted to do that. They sent out letters to prisoners, to 40-something prisoners. They got 9 back from those prisoners, and then there was and that was then further reduced to 5 because the prisoners wouldn't sign waivers at the time. So the bulk of the book really is based on the analysis of cases that they've done. And then they use that small number of cases, detailed interviews of the small number of cases, to sort of juxtapose with that other information. There have been, in 2021, there were 600, and numbers do begin to look astronomical. There were 692 mass shootings in the United States overall. Mass shooting is defined typically, and in this case, in this book, certainly as a shooting in which 4 or more people are killed, not including the perpetrator of it. So, that number is a significant number overall and a significant problem, I think. New York has had 100 mass shootings. New York State has had 100 mass shootings in the last 5 years, which is extraordinary. So we all know the Buffalo shooting, we all know a variety of other shootings, but New York has had a very large number, and Rochester itself has had a large number, when the definition is the shooting of 4 or more people. And I will say this, when you look at interpersonal violence and you look at mass shooting violence, one of the things that I find myself getting concerned about in many ways is whether or not there is a sort of there is a commingling of these two kinds of problems, because we are seeing numbers of group mass shootings that affect a lot of people on the street that begin as conflicts between individuals or groups. And that's a different animal, I think, than we have become used to with regard to interpersonal violence or mass shooting violence. And I think that's that is a very deep concern. I think there are a variety of things that are counterposed or conflicting in all of this sort of thing. One is, I've already mentioned, the sense that no one is safe with regard to mass shootings. I think there's some truth to that. That is, their very nature is to be unpredictable on this, and so it engenders, I think, a very significant sense of being at risk in all kinds of activity. That, though, you have to counterpose with the rate of these shootings and the number of cases, because these are rare. These are rare events, but they are, I try to think of what they may be equivalent to in some ways, and the only thing I can come up with is a shark attack. That is, there's little that people contribute to becoming victims in this sort of event, and there's little way of anticipating those things occurring. The other conflict, and this is a significant conflict in thinking about this, and it's a significant conflict that's in this book, the attention to mass shootings has really been dominated by thinking about the psychological conditions that bring mass shooting. And so the concern has always been with what are the psychological conditions of mass shooters, and that typically has involved a retrospective analysis of those cases that determine a lot of or I try to identify a lot of the issues overall. But the emphasis is on individual issues and psychological issues overall, and there's almost no attention to any sense of a cultural context. There's recognition that guns are involved, certainly, right? That's certainly true. But any other sort of cultural context with a reference to conditions in the United States that make this a unique problem in the United States, or to the interactions in communities and the interactions of different kinds of perpetrators and victims, it's hard to fit both of these things in the same kind of discussion. The fact remains that fear, and I'll save it, but a lot of cultural questions and cultural issues could be drawn into this discussion that are not. This particular book, I think, handles the psychological issues, the individual issues very well, but doesn't place anything in a different context in any way. And this book also combines a variety of things. A third of the cases in the file are work-related mass shootings. That's their biggest category. The second category is shootings in restaurants, which I had no idea that people objected to the cooking to that level. 14% were school shootings, K through 12, and 12% are university shootings. And I think that is kind of a combination of things in which there are probably significant differences across those to pay attention to that are not paid attention to at that time. Overall, the book goes on, I think, to lay out an argument in virtually all of its chapters about the individual experiences of shooters, even with this sort of combination of shooters and different kinds of shootings. So it begins with this sort of discussion of mass shooters as monsters, which I think is a common characterization of this, and probably probably a useful one in many ways. But it basically says that although we prefer to think of these people all as monsters, they in fact dwell among us, and they're probably people with the potential for this are more prevalent than we would like to think in some ways. And they make some minor comments about American culture, but basically argue that the individual experiences of these shooters share things in common that increases the likelihood that they will do this. And those things are, first, trauma. They found that the vast majority of these shooters had undergone some sort of traumatic experience fairly close to the time of their shooting. A conflict at home, sometimes a loss of a parent, unsuccessful in establishing friendships in school and other places. And that trauma then is the next step in this argument is that the shooters have, in very large numbers, experienced a crisis event, an event fairly close to the date of the shooting that they defined as a crisis, as critical, and one that separated them out from the rest of the community. They also argue that a universal or near universal factor is that they tend not to have close relationships with many people at all. They increasingly distance themselves from people, so they find themselves alone, and then the view starts to creep in that there may be some value to them for engaging in mass shootings. They often leak information about the plan of what they're going to do, and we've seen in many cases that friends or family or others are informed about the potential for this happening, and that goes all the way back to the Colorado theater shooting that was there. That in many cases, the trouble in people's minds, the trouble in people's homes, gets translated into hate against some group. The South Carolina shooting is a very good example of that, the church shooting. But there's a very common element of hate overall. And then opportunity. And the opportunity is really access to guns. And most of these shooters find guns at home. Most of the shooters get them from their family, either intentionally or unintentionally, and they end up using those guns that way. So the picture that emerges is one in which the act of mass shootings is a function of the individual's inability to sort of respond to the world around them, the individual's internal processes and thought processes, and there's very little in the book that ties it to any cultural or structural elements that are outside of the realm of that particular individual. The book includes a number of things I didn't expect to find in there. For example, it is critical of having police officers in schools, and it argues that police officers in schools may add fuel to the fire, essentially, by creating this sense of a dangerous environment for the person who becomes a shooter. They have difficulties with the sort of common approach to training school teachers and students to respond to circumstances that may produce shootings. Lockdown drills, things like that are seen as supporting a view of the world that fosters some likelihood of creating the outcome that they're intended to refute. this in many ways is a unexpected kind of finding overall. I will say that the difficulties, I see a couple of difficulties with this orientation overall. As common as they are, these events are statistically rare. And so the methodology that they use in this book and the methodology applied overall to the analysis of this problem is to focus on compilations of the characteristics of mass shooters. And so what a lot of the work in this area does is compile profiles of mass shooters and the experience that mass shooters have had. That I think is not an inaccurate view of this concerns with trauma and concerns with crisis and fractured relationships and all of those things, because it finds those things in retrospectively in a retrospective analysis, and what appears to be built is a sense of mental health issues, mental illness issues in the shooter that go back in some period of time. But the problem with it is it depends on the shooting itself to diagnose mental illness. And that seems to be an unhelpful direction overall. You'd want to be able to make predictions about things independent of the event itself. So these kinds of retrospective analysis, which is, and I understand the problem. They looked at a variety of cases in a very small number of interviews that resulted in that conclusion. But the reconstruction of the events may appear to be helpful overall, but it's not helpful in terms of offering information that's useful for predicting and intervening in some ways. And given the nature of this problem, there's virtually no documentation of successful efforts to prevent mass shootings. It's hard to even think how that might be measured overall. So you're left with data collected on mass shooting events and on mass shooters, and from a statistical methodological perspective, there's nothing to predict off of that, because all your cases fall into one category when prediction requires at least some successes and some other cases. The second problem that I see with these issues, and it's the problem, it's a version of the same problem, but arguably it's a problem on the opposite side, and that is the focus on individual shooters, blames individuals, finds individuals flawed in the process, focus on the psychology of individuals and on the abnormality of the incidents, the unusualness and the abnormality of the incident. It doesn't focus questions on larger social issues in any meaningful kind of way. Why is this a unique U.S. problem, right? There's no place in the world that suffers this the way we do in the United States. Is the access to guns, which is barely discussed in the book. The access to guns is also a unique condition. Why, in fact, do we have that kind of access to guns overall in this community? Are guns a symptom of the same problem, right? Are the prevalence of guns a symptom of the same set of issues? Or are they, is the sort of fear and anxiety in American culture relevant to the selection of guns and relevant to the building of some hostility in some ways. I think about this from my background, and I apologize already for saying this, but as a normal curve kind of problem. That is, the vast majority of people are in the middle of any set of sort of opinions about things. The shooters themselves are clearly are clearly at the smallest end, one end of this set of shooters, but their position can be supported or thwarted by the rest of the population overall, by the cultural values placed on things. And the fact that we have this kind of problem suggests that the breakdown can't be, understanding that breakdown can't be fully appreciated without looking beyond those individual cases. My background is in sociology, right? This is a book that is very heavily focused on the psychology of this because that's the data that becomes available. So you study these events and you study the histories of the individuals and you collect that information. Sociology has focused much of its work on what classical sociology has talked about as social facts. That is, facts shared among members of a culture. Facts shared, values, in fact, shared among the members of a culture. And the ability for that set of values and norms that govern behavior to become a significant part, very deep in that culture. And that's what, in fact, drives behavior. Durkheim, most famous sociologist, focused, the best example of that may have been his analysis of suicide, where he talked about suicide in different nationalities in Europe, and very broadly different rates of suicide, even though conditions of life didn't differ very much, but rather the sort of values and norms of those cultures differed significantly. So he talked about anomic suicide. He talked about Catholics being more likely to commit suicide than Protestants in different parts of the country. And he talked about the social influence of community to create certain kinds of outcomes. And that, I think, is an analysis that can help contribute to understanding this kind of violence and do something about that. The notion that the U.S., with its diversity, its differences, its tensions inside, its racial tensions, its class tensions, the idea that those are of no consequence in this kind of violence seems to me to be a huge oversight, and that this notion of simply being able to diagnose individuals after the fact on this doesn't give you as much insight as you should be looking for in changing the nature that produces these kinds of outcomes. We are alone across the country doing this. There is no reason to think that the prevalence of mental health problems, the prevalence of crisis, all of those things, I think there are probably very few people who grow up without crises. There are very few people who grow up without different sorts of problems and problematic relationships that would not look atypical to many of the cases that they talk about, but don't wind up in those kinds of outcomes. So to focus entirely on individuals, I think, really limits the ability of a society to examine itself and examine the cause of these problems even when this particular problem is so extraordinarily unusual, you have to, I think, if you're going to think about this problem in the U.S. context, which is the only context in which it exists, then you have to look at the nature of this society, these communities, and what may generate the kind of problems that wind up exhibiting this kind of behavior. I don't know if it makes any sense to you. I get paid either way. That's what I would always tell my students. So, you know, I hope my 2.5 hours are up at this point, but I would love to hear what people think of this, and if you have questions or comments.